Everyone, this is Professor Lodato. I wanted to walk you through the definition essay presentation. So there are two different types of short definitions. One is the class that a subject belongs to, its distinguishing features, and it's often at the beginning of an essay just to kind of set your terms. Stipulative definition is a fuller explanation that specifies a particular way that you are using a term. This could be biased or misleading. For example, if by love you mean someone who pays for everything for you, that's kind of its own tiny definition of love and not encompassing of the whole word. Now, by contrast, most of our essays were extended definition. An extended definition may take a whole paragraph. It could even be the whole essay. The purpose is to explore a topic in its full complexity and sometimes argue for or against a particular meaning. We could be competing to define a term a certain way. And an extended definition, it shows the reader the subject in detail. It will establish the boundaries. You really define something by saying where the boundary lines are around it, and it will define the word or phenomenon. So if I'm trying to define love, I might have to draw a boundary about what is and what is not love. Now, your thesis is the center of all your ideas, and you have to gather it into one controlling idea. If I'm defining love as willing the good of another, that will be my overarching idea. Everything I say about love has to fit within that. If I'm saying love is what other people do for me, now I have to tilt everything in the essay towards that view. The thesis statement could be shown in the very last sentence of a definition essay because we've built to it over a long period of time. So two things to keep in mind for evidence. Every generalization has to have concrete evidence, an actual example that's concrete about that general statement. And remember that you're always trying to draw that boundary, enclose an abstract concept. It's not hard to define something that exists in the physical world, but it is really hard to define an abstract concept like love, philosophy, the ideal college experience. So you're trying to draw a boundary. This is the type of thing. This is the Google definition of privilege. And as you'll see in the readings from this week, privilege was at the heart of all of it. Google defines privilege as a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group of people. Is this specific enough of a definition? Probably not for the purposes of these essays we read. So the first one was actually by a Princeton student. He's younger than some of us in the class. He was born in 1994. He published this piece in Time magazine as well as in the conservative Princetonian newspaper. And he does mention some things that show his political bias towards a more Republican bent. He mentions President Obama. He mentions Tea Party radicals. So you do see politics informing him. It had a very controversial reaction when this was published online on Time magazine. He argues against the phrase check your privilege, quote unquote. So here's a long quote from paragraph 2 that kind of sums it up. But I do condemn them for diminishing everything I have personally accomplished, all the hard work I have done in my life, and for ascribing all the fruit I reap, not to the seeds I sow, but to some invisible patron saint of male whiteness who places it out for me before I even arrive. Check your privilege, and I realize that nothing you have accomplished is real. So this author kind of takes the stance that when you mention my privilege, you are taking away all that I worked hard for, and just you're saying because I'm white, because I'm a man, those are the things that have created the atmosphere of my success and not any work on my part. And this author really defines his privilege based on his family's experiences, particularly resiliency, surviving the Holocaust, and then arrival in America, and then starting a successful life here after that great tragedy. He goes on in paragraph 15 of his essay to say, it's not a matter of white or black, male or female, or any other division which we seek, but a matter of the values we pass along, the legacy we leave that perpetuates privilege. And there's nothing wrong with that. So he has a very positive definition of privilege not being associated with these cultural, racial, or gendered factors, right, that we traditionally have in that check your privilege phrase, but that it's this values. And he ends the essay with that giant statement, I have checked my privilege and I apologize for nothing. He even goes on to say, when you call someone out for their privilege, you're defining their narrative based on predetermined factors, which he would argue is worse than just allowing people to live their life experience. So that's a very specific definition of privilege. And we, as students here at CCM, need to take into account he has a lot of different factors in his life, not only his race, gender, ethnicity, religion, but also he's a kid who went to Princeton. And that's a certain level of privilege that, is something that he might not be acknowledging as well. Let's move on to Roxanne Gay, who's talking directly to Tal Fortgang. She is a prominent author. She's described as this quote unquote bad feminist, PhD in rhetoric, and she's a professor at Purdue University. She's a Haitian American woman who is queer identified at various points in her life. So obviously a very different background than Tal Fortgang. So she talks early in the essay about realizing she had privilege on this visit to Haiti. She says, quote, "a necessary education on privilege and the grace of an American passport." She goes on in paragraph 2 to list this whole bunch of examples of the poverty she sees in Haiti and how different that is to her life here in America. Just the privilege of being an American makes your worldview entirely different than what she was seeing in Haiti. In paragraph 3, she defines privilege and then states, quote, "nearly everyone, particularly in the developed world, has something someone else doesn't, something someone else yearns for." And that's the interesting way she defines privilege, is that I have something that you don't have, and you have something that I don't have. And each of those haves and have nots means that we have a type of privilege over one another. And she defines privilege as this like ongoing project, how she personally is going to try and recover an understanding of the privileges she has. It is somewhat embarrassing for me to accept just how much privilege I have, she says in paragraph 5. We tend to believe that accusations of privilege imply we have it easy, which we resent because life is harder for nearly everyone. She's directly addressing Fortgang's issue with privilege here, right? It's hard for everyone. It's still tough. Life is difficult. And we take it personally when people say, well, you don't have it as bad as I do. She compares it like the privilege oppression Olympics, where she's trying to compare, okay, is my experience as a gay black woman different than your experience as a disabled white Jewish man? That's very problematic to her, the kind of competing privileges. She says, "the acknowledgement of my privilege is not a denial of the ways I have and am marginalized, the ways I have suffered." And she directly talks to Fortgang in the next paragraph. You don't have to apologize for your privilege. You have to understand. You need to understand that your life and my life have different paths forward. We have different narratives, but we both experience privileges that the other one does not have. And some people have much more privilege than others, while all of us do have that privilege to a certain extent. Even being here at CCM, we're all college students. That's not a privilege that every student has. And at some point in your life, perhaps you did not have that privilege to be able to get the education that you are now getting, right? We're even experiencing this privilege now that we're able to communicate digitally. That's a very different privilege that some students across the country and across the world don't have. And during this coronavirus, the fact that we have our health is probably the biggest privilege of all, if we're lucky enough to have us and our loved ones be safe from it. So I want you to keep in mind that privilege is a very complicated topic. And while both of these authors approach it from a different vantage point, these two rival definitions make for an exchange of intellectual ideas. And even though these authors would entirely disagree, they can still have a conversation about it.